Hi, welcome to the bathtub, where when you hear this music and you see this whiteboard with the words pointless and meaningless on the whiteboard, you know it's time for another Pointless Adventures in Literature. It's one of our theme shows here at the bathtub. Sometimes the adventures are pointless, sometimes they're meaningless, sometimes they're both pointless and meaningless, but they're always pointless, meaningless, or both, and you can bank on that at the bathtub. We never renege on that promise. It's one of the few things we always carry through on. We have it's brought to you as usual by AWCBA, the shadowy, nebulous organization that exists at the periphery of our understanding. It stands for, at least I believe it stands for, Amazon and the Washington Post can kiss my ass. They basically leave notes on my car telling me and everyone who listens to me, both of them, to not buy anything by Jeff Bezos because he treats part-time workers like crap. That goes for the Washington Post and Amazon. And I have to say, I can say that I've been much better. I'm not perfect. I haven't been perfect, but I have reduced my Amazon consumption by at least 90%. I have to say, not long ago, we had one of those free deals where they gave you like a month free. I took it for free, and I bought something on it, but I'm going to cancel it as soon as my free membership ends because I hate that. I hate that bastard. Okay, the story this week is called the Meaning of Dazzle, and that's the title of our pointless adventure. These adventures they're not pointless to me. They're actually they should be pointless to you if you have a life, but for me they're sometimes quite meaningful adventures. We try to start them though with a rhetorical question, because nothing's more pointless than a rhetorical question. And this week, our pointless adventure has to ask this question: what does the classic 60s science fiction novel by William F. Nolan and George Clayton Johnson, Logan's Run, that's the first paperback Dell edition from the 60s, which was later adapted into a kind of, I wouldn't call it a classic movie. It's a famous science fiction movie from the early 70s called Logan's Run with Michael York. And it has a fond place in many people's hearts, like the Omega Man and Soylent Green, all these kind of bad early 70s science fiction movies, most of which I have to say are pretty terrible. This is really awful. But because it was like the only science fiction on TV, we watched it when we were kids, and so we have these kind of fond memories of it. Anyway, this was based on this. And what do those classic science fiction books have to do with my self-published book, Dazzle Resplendent? I published this myself. I'm afraid to say I actually designed the cover and I picked those horrible colors, and I published it on Amazon. Isn't that horrible? So don't buy it from Amazon if you can't help it. If you want to buy it directly from me, you can. I'll give you a better deal than them, and I'll sign it. But mainly, it's probably one of my favorite books, and it's a series of stories I wrote about a dog who hates human beings, and his name is Dazzle. And the stories were published in a number of places in the past 20, 30. I first published the first Dazzle story was published in the early 80s in England in an anthology called Other Edens 2, which I can't find. I was going to show you, but I can't find it. And I've been publishing stories about Dazzle over the decades, including fantasy and science fiction did one. There've been some in my favorite was in the Baffler a few years ago. Chris Lemon kindly published one of my favorite stories, and one was in Fence, and I put 7 of the stories together, and I'm still writing these stories. And if there's any luck, I'll continue publishing and writing Dazzle stories until the next Trump administration, which is when I'm going to jump off the balcony, and I'm going to film that. The next time they let that bastard into the White House, I'm going to jump off the balcony and I'm going to film my last words. This is our floral pattern Manhattan, just like the one Philip Marlowe drinks in the Long Goodbye, and he used a floral pattern martini glass. And I'll tell my pointless story. So usually these pointless stories are hard for me to remember because I don't remember much of anything, and they are really pointless. So I had a kind of very brief association with one of the authors of Logan's Run, which was George Clayton Johnson. Now, many people probably know George, and I'm going to move this out of the way just because the glare drives me a little crazy. And many people know George, so I'm not going to hope I don't say anything flattering about him because I liked him very much, but I didn't know him very well. So most people who knew George knew him better than me. I met George Clayton Johnson when I was like 14 years old. And I went to my first and probably my last science fiction convention in San Francisco, where I was 14. I'd saved up my money for my paper route to go spend the weekend at the science fiction convention. And there were a number of writers I met there, and I really had a great time. Chelsea Quinn Yarbrough was a friend of mine. And hi, Chelsea. Hope you're well. You're well. Quinn. And I met people like David Gerrold and really his friend Stephen Golden and lots of different people, and watched old movies in the middle of some auditorium, and I had a great time. And I was very shy, so I never talked to anybody. But at the same time, I met George there. I'm pretty sure that's the first time I met George Clayton Johnson. And he was a very interesting sort of character. I'm not going to really be able to describe him very well. But this was the late 60s, and George looked kind of like an old hippie. That's the best way I can say it. George looked, he was like really like rail thin, really long-limbed guy. He wore these long-sleeve T-shirts that I associate with kind of young hippies in Haight-Ashbury, and really tight pants, like really tight bell-bottom pants. And he had long gray hair. And all I can remember is that when I go to these like little parties for this at the science fiction convention, you go to these little parties where people were there. I didn't know anybody. No one would talk to me. No one wanted to talk to me. I was too shy to talk to anybody. George walked right up and just started talking to me and some other kid who was like my age. And he was very friendly, and he was just chatting away and talking about all his experiences in Hollywood and writing and all this sort of stuff. As soon as I met him, from the first moment he walked up and said hi and started talking to me, he pulled out a joint, like a giant joint. Every time I saw George Clayton Johnson in the 60s, he had like bags of marijuana all over him. And he'd pull out this joint, and I was like 14. I think it's the only time in my life a grown-up walked up to me and said, "You want to smoke some grass?" I said, "Sure." And I got totally wasted. And George kind of just talked about all this interesting stuff. And that was my first association with George Clayton Johnson. I talked to him a couple times at a party. One of the things that's interesting about George, now the Logan's Run is a much better book than this movie, which I have to say is one of the most boring movies I've ever seen. The book is kind of interesting. It's much more interesting than the movie. There's a number of things about it that I like, but one of them is it's kind of a well-written book. Both Johnson and Nolan were kind of buddies of Ray Bradbury, and and Charles Beaumont, and a bunch of really kind of cool writers in L.A. in the 50s and 60s. And they all kind of they seem to have gravitated around Bradbury, but they were all really interesting writers. Richard Matheson was in this crowd. And this is actually a really kind of well-written thriller, futuristic thriller. And one idea of it that's much more interesting than the movie is that it's about a world where young people, you get killed after you reach a certain age because there's, I don't know why, but it's too many people or something. And in the book, it's 21. So basically all these people who are acting like adults and are children. They're all children who are running the world, and the world looks like it. In the movie, they can live till they're 30. It's just that they all look like Michael York, who looks 30. It doesn't quite work. But it's kind of a well-written book. And that idea is quite interesting. And so this is worth checking out. It reminds me a lot of Robert Sheckley, who we're going to talk about soon. George Clayton Johnson was also well known. He and William F. Nolan wrote two scripts together. One was Nolan's Run, which they probably lived off that for quite a long time. They also wrote Ocean's 11. So they wrote like two movie scripts, which just are still being made. They're still making these movies. And if George was alive, I'm sure he'd be raking it in. I think William Nolan is still alive and still producing good work. So, and the other thing that George Clayton Johnson was well known for when I met him was he had written a lot of probably some of the best of the Twilight Zones. So I was a kid, like many kids of my generation. I watched lots of Twilight Zones, especially in rerun. And he wrote the famous Kick the Can episode, and he wrote a few others, but he and Richard Matheson and Charles Beaumont were really the heart and soul of that show. They did almost all of the best scripts for it. Much better scripts, by the way, than Rod Serling's, who was good, but they were much more interesting. Beaumont is a really interesting writer. So anyway, I met this guy. He was a really nice guy. He was sort of a star, but he acted like a really nice, pleasant person, really easygoing. And about a year later, I went to my first. I went to my only workshops. I went to a workshop called the Clarion West Workshop. It was run by Vonda McIntyre, wonderful lady, wonderful girl, good, really good writer, nice person, and I went there for 6 weeks, and I was a terrible writer, and just awful, and I didn't know what I was doing, and everyone was very nice to me. And Vonda had George come as our first week writer guest. I don't think he'd ever done a writing workshop, but George came, and he did a week with us, and it was very surreal because basically I'm pretty sure that he used to come in at 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, and pass around joints. I'm pretty sure he was passing around joints in the university lecture room that we had, and we were all smoking grass. And he was talking, and he was kind of he was a very interesting guy, but he was just going off on little tangents. For 2 or 3 days, he read a script he was writing, which was about Christopher Columbus, and it was the craziest thing. I still remember this pretty vividly. This script. It was about Christopher Columbus, and someone had hired George to write something about the bicentennial, American bicentennial. It had to be about Columbus. And George said, every time I write a script, I imagine George C. Scott is the star. So the whole time I listened to him read this thing, it was George C. Scott. And the way George wrote the script, it was that Columbus comes to America, and he basically comes into the modern world and sees what a fucking mess it is. And it's all game shows and crap and Nixon and this whole nightmarish world. And it's a pretty funny script, and it had nothing to do with Columbus, really. Anyway, he read that for 2 or 3 days. And then we talked. We sat. We smoked grass, it seemed like, the whole time he was there. I often, when I tell this story to my students, I used to say, this is unflattering. I hope this doesn't seem unflattering, but I always think of Pigpen. You know Pigpen in the Peanuts scripts? He's got that big cloud around him. Well, George was not Pigpen. He was very clean, very, very, very well laundered person, even though he looked like an older hippie. But he had this. I always think of this cloud of marijuana coming around George. I don't know if this was all his life, but certainly the brief time I knew him, he was always smoking grass, and it was very good marijuana, by the way. So he came, he did the workshop, and I don't remember anything else from the workshop except he gave us one piece of advice. In fact, I remember him giving it to me twice. And I really liked the advice, and it stuck in my head. And he said, a lot of the times when I don't know what I'm going to write, I just sit down, I get a clean piece of paper, and I put it in the typewriter, and I scroll it up, and I write at the top, Dazzle Page. And if I put Dazzle Page at the top of a sheet of paper, that means I can write anything I fucking want, and it doesn't have to be good, and I'm just going to have some fun. And, I was a very uptight writer most of my life. I still am a pretty uptight writer. I really have a hard time getting the thing started or getting it the way I want it. And when it's going well, it goes quickly. But when getting to that point where it's going well is a lot of work, is a lot of sweat. And I really had trouble starting new things. Because like many writers, you want to know what it's about, how it's going to work out, and what happens at the end. All the stupid things I try to now stop my students from doing. But at the time, I did them all myself. So I remember this Dazzle Page idea of George's. And many years later, it would have had to have been like 15 or 20 years later, I was living in Chadwell Heath in England at Colin Greenland's house. And I was starting to write better than I had in the past. I was writing a lot of short stories. And one day I finished up the work I was working on. I didn't know what I was going to write next. And I sat down, I had a computer then. I had this old Amstrad computer. And I decided to do what George suggested. And I started a page, I said Dazzle Page. And I went for a walk. I had no idea what I was going to write about. And as I was going for a walk, I saw a bunch of dogs running around this kind of... In England, there's like little local parks that are actually old graveyards from like Victorian or Georgian periods. These really old, with old leaning gravestones. And I was walking through one. I saw these 3 dogs by themselves, and there was nobody with them. And they were just wandering around. And it hit me at the time. I looked at them and I thought, dogs don't really like to be with people. Dogs like being with other dogs. And it was like a kind of one of these little, whether it's true or not, I just thought, we all think that the dogs really want us around, but they looked really happy just being by themselves. So I walked home, and by the time I got back, I based it looked like my old dog Cider, And I started off with Dazzle was a dog. There was such and such. I can't remember the opening. I won't read it. Dazzle was a dog who did such and such. And from Dazzle page, Dazzle became a character. I wrote the story over about 8 to 10 days, which is a really good. That's my ideal pace when I find the opening of a story. About 10, maybe 10 or 12 days, and then I rewrote it and cut it for several weeks after that, and it turned into a story I was really proud of. I really enjoyed the story a lot, and it all kind of started with this idea of George's. But then, many years later, I don't believe in sequels. In fact, I hate the idea of a sequel. Most of my life, I've always thought sequels were terrible. I sort of loved this dog. So about 10 or 15 years later, I decided I wanted to write another Dazzle story. And it was called Dazzle Redux, play off the Updike title. And it was about Dazzle going to meet his father. And that was an incredibly hard story to write. But to make a long story short, Gordon Van Gelder at the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction bought that one and published some subsequent ones. And the trick to me for every Dazzle story was to kind of really take him into a totally new territory, kind of a new conceptual territory. And so, he becomes a movie writer. He writes for the movies, and he becomes he goes into seances. He can speak to the dead. He goes into outer space to come up with completely weird ideas to put Dazzle in these really wildly different things. But for the upshot of it was that it all came from this one little idea of George's. Dazzle page, and I don't write Dazzle page at the top of when I start new things, but when I'm really desperate, I don't know what I want to write about, I still use that philosophy, which is I'm just going to sit down and have a good time. And usually if you start off and you can do that and stop worrying about where you're going, it turns out for the best. Okay, I think I'm going to keep it short there. It was too long already, but that's my history of Dazzle and why I've been spent 35 years writing these silly stories. Big shout out to Bruce Ferber and his partner Chris Pearson for reasons they know, and I'll hopefully see you all soon. I'll do a couple more of these tonight, I think, while I try to avoid the reading the newspaper. Happy bathing, stay safe. Bye.